Good morning. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm the President and CEO and Director of the PPIC Statewide Survey at the Public Policy Institute of California. I would like to welcome you to our virtual program today, featuring the findings of our annual survey of Californians on the environment. The survey was conducted with funding from the Dirk and Charlene Capsinel Foundation and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. We want to thank them for their support for this work and for their support for today's event. For today's program, my colleague Alyssa Dykman will walk you through some of the key findings of the survey. After her presentation, I will share some of my takeaways, and then we'll answer some audience questions. If you have a question, please send an email to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'd appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question. And now I would like to introduce my colleague, Alyssa Dykman, who was the project manager of this PPIC Environment Survey. And Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. So bear with me as I bring our slides up. Great. So thank you again, Mark, for the introduction. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the other co-authors on this report, including Dean Bonner and Rachel Lawler. Now, this survey is the 20th in PPIC's annual Californians and Environment Survey Series. The mission of the survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions that we hope will help inform and improve state policy making, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. This survey was conducted from July 8th to the 17th online using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, and it was conducted in either English or Spanish, depending on the preference of the survey respondent. We surveyed over 1,500 California adults, including about 1,000 who we deemed as likely to vote. The margin of error, as you can see on the slide, was 3.4 for all adults and 3.9 for likely voters. And the survey comprised of two main sections. The first looked at climate change and energy policy, while the second looked at environmental issues and within the context of the 2020 election. So just starting off, we turn to Californians' views on their elected officials' handling of environmental issues. So when we look at our state elected officials, we find 2 in 3 California adults and likely voters approve of Governor Newsom's handling of environmental issues. Partisans are divided, however, with 9 in 10 Democrats and 2 in 3 independents approving, whereas 7 in 10 Republicans disapprove. Across regions, more than 6 in 10 approve of the governor's handling of environmental issues, with approval highest in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, with respect to the California legislature, similar shares of adults and likely voters approve of its handling of environmental issues. Again, we see Democrats and independents are far more likely than Republicans to approve. And similarly, majorities across regions approve, with those in Los Angeles and again, the Bay Area, the most likely to approve. Whereas looking at our federal elected officials, approval remains far lower. That's 24% of all adults and 29% of likely voters that approve of the president's handling of environmental issues. For Congress, 20% of adults and likely voters approve. For the president's approval on environmental issues, we find about 3 in 4 Republicans approve, while 7 in 10 independents and about 9 in 10 Democrats disapprove. Residents in the Central Valley are the most likely to approve of the president, whereas those in the Bay Area are the least likely. Congress's handling of environmental issues in the US has even more widespread disapproval. There's partisan agreement on disapproval, with 2 and 3 Republicans and 8 and 10 Democrats and independents disapproving of the way Congress is handling environmental issues. We also see across all of the state's major regions and demographic groups, majorities are more than about 7 in 10 disapprove. Now we'll just turn to a series of questions regarding the perceptions of Californians on climate change. So survey respondents were asked when the effects of global warming will begin to happen. And today we find strong majorities say global warming is happening now. And this is consistent with what we've seen in previous years as well. Across regions, majorities hold this view, with those in the Bay Area the most likely. Across demographic groups, 6 in 10 or more say the effects have already begun. And when we look across political parties, 8 in 10 Democrats, 7 in 10 independents say the effects are happening now, compared to about 4 in 10 Republicans. More so, 1 in 4 Republicans say the effects will never happen. Now, just looking at concerns about specific effects of climate change in California, we see that about 6 in 10 Californians say they are very concerned about more severe droughts and wildfires, while about half are concerned about more severe heat waves. And we find 1 in 3 are very concerned about rising sea levels. On all 4 of these possible impacts, Democrats are much more likely than independents, and they are far more likely than Republicans to say they are very concerned. Some just notable findings about each of these various impacts. When it comes to severe droughts, half or more are across regions are very concerned, with those in Los Angeles and the Bay Area the most likely to say this. On the issue of wildfires, we see that majorities across regions, with the exception of Orange County, San Diego, say they're very concerned. When it comes to more severe heat waves, about half in the Bay Area, Inland Empire, and Los Angeles are very concerned, compared to about 4 in 10 elsewhere. And finally, when it comes to rising sea levels, coastal residents are somewhat more likely than inland residents to be concerned. Now, not only are Californians concerned about global warming, they are also personally invested in the issue. More than 8 in 10 Californians say global warming is important to them personally, including nearly 6 in 10 who say it is extremely or very important to them personally. In fact, compared to adults nationwide, Californians are far more likely to say the issue is extremely or very important to them personally. And when we look across partisans, we see Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to say it is extremely important to them. And across racial and ethnic groups, 3 in 10 Latinos say it's extremely important to them, compared to about 1 in 4 in other racial and ethnic groups. Californians are also willing to make changes to address the issue of global warming. 7 in 10 adults and likely voters say they are willing to make major lifestyle changes to address this issue. This includes 9 in 10 Democrats, 3 in 4 independents, and about 1 in 3 Republicans. There are notable racial and ethnic group differences, with Latinos the most likely and whites the least likely to say they're willing to make major lifestyle changes, and that's a difference of 27 percentage points. Majorities across demographic groups also say they're willing, but parents are more likely than non-parents, women are more likely than men, and renters are more likely than homeowners to say that they are willing. Californians also continue to support the state taking a leading role in addressing climate change. Of course, this is all going on when the state's political leaders and the federal government continue to move in very different directions in this area. 7 in 10 adults and likely voters favor the state making its own policies separate from the federal government to address global warming. And since we first asked this question in 2005, more than half have held this view. We also find that more than 7 in 10 Californians say it is important that the state acts as a leader when it comes to efforts to fight climate change, including 4 in 10 that say it's very important. For both of these questions, Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to both be in favor as well as say it's very important. Now, looking at specific climate policies. So the California Air Resources Board announced in 2018 that the state had reduced greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels, which were 2 years in advance of the 2020 goal set by Assembly Bill 32. In 2006, policymakers passed Senate Bill 32, which set a new goal of further reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. When asked about this goal, more than 3 in 4 Californians are in favor, including 96% of Democrats, 70% of independents, and 42% of Republicans. Across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely to be in favor, and more than 7 in 10 across regions and education, gender, and income groups are in favor. And notably, younger Californians, or those age 18 to 34, are much more likely than older Californians to be in favor. We also look at another policy enacted by former Governor Brown, SB 100, which requires that 100% of the state's electricity to be generated by renewable energy sources by 2045. When asked about this renewable energy goal, most Californians support it. This includes 9 in 10 Democrats, 7 in 10 independents, and 4 in 10 Republicans. Overwhelming majorities across regions are in favor, with those in Los Angeles the most likely to hold this view. For context, the California Energy Commission estimated in 2018 that 34% of California's electricity was derived from renewable sources. Now, although Californians overwhelmingly support the 100% renewable goal, they are divided on whether they are willing or not willing to pay more for electricity if it were generated by renewable sources like solar or wind energy. Today, about half of adults and likely voters say they're willing, and the other half says they're not willing. There is a wide partisan divide, and willingness also varies by region, with a high of 62% in the Bay Area that say they're willing, to a low of 35% in the Central Valley. Now, another policy implemented in recent years to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address environmental disparities is the state's cap and trade program. So the program complements other measures to ensure California cost effectively meets its emissions reduction goals, and some of its revenues are spent on projects to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as affordable housing near public transit and energy efficiency. So while a majority of Californians say they have heard a little or nothing at all about the state's cap and trade program, majorities nonetheless are still in favor of it after being read a brief description about the program. And when asked how important it is that some of the cap and trade revenues are spent on projects to improve environmental conditions in lower income and disadvantaged communities, we find 8 in 10 Californians say it is important, including 4 in 10 who say it is very important. Those with lower incomes are more likely to say it's very important, and across racial and ethnic groups, African Americans and Latinos are much more likely than Asian Americans and far more likely than whites to hold this view. And notably, about half of renters in California say it's very important, compared to about 1 in 3 homeowners. Now, in regards to ocean and coastal policies, so we asked a question we've been tracking for over a decade now, and that's whether Californians support allowing more oil drilling off the coast. So although the Trump administration has reported plans to develop and expand oil and gas leasing along the Pacific coast, when asked about allowing this, Californians, majorities of them are opposed. In fact, 73% are opposed, and only about 1 in 4 are in favor. Across parties, an overwhelming majority of Democrats and independents are opposed, while a majority of Republicans are in favor. Now, about 7 in 10 or more across regions, and more than 2 in 3 across age, education, income, and racial and ethnic groups are opposed. Now, nearly all of Californians say the condition of the ocean and beaches is very important to the state's economy and quality of life, and many are concerned about issues that affect our coastline. When it comes to plastics and marine debris, nearly 2 in 3 Californians say this is a big problem along the part of the coast closest to them. Majorities across demographic groups see plastics as a big problem, as do majorities across regions, with those in Los Angeles the most likely to say it's a big problem. With respect to declining marine life, about half of adults say it is a big problem, and Los Angeles residents are again the most likely to see this as a big problem. Across partisans, Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to say this as well. When it comes to fish and seafood contamination, just under half of Californians see it as a big problem. Majorities of Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans hold this view, compared to about 4 in 10 whites. And finally, fewer Californians say limited public access to the coast and beach is a big problem. Similar proportions of Democrats, independents, and Republicans view this as a big problem, and 1 in 4 or fewer across regions and demographic groups hold this view. Now, turning to more environmental justice related questions, we asked how serious a health threat air pollution and the pollution of drinking water is to survey respondents and their families. So we find just under half of California adults say polluted drinking water is a very serious or a somewhat serious threat to them and their family and their part of the state, while about 2 in 3 say air pollution is a serious threat. On both of these issues, whites are far less likely than Latinos and African Americans, and less likely than Asian Americans to say they're a very serious threat. Regionally, residents in Los Angeles are the most likely to say the pollution of drinking water and air pollution is a very serious threat in their region. So finally, with less than 100 days to the November presidential election, about 8 in 10 likely voters are following the news very or fairly closely. We also find about 8 in 10 likely voters say the presidential candidate's positions on the environment are important in determining their vote. Democratic likely voters are far more likely than independents and Republicans to hold this view. And across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are much more likely than those in other racial and ethnic groups to say it's very important. We also find that younger Californians are more likely than older Californians to say the environment is very important. And regionally, those in Los Angeles are the most likely to say it's important in determining their vote. Now, when asked which candidate for president would do a better job handling environmental issues in the US, 70% of likely voters say Joe Biden and 29% say Donald Trump. Nearly all of Democrats prefer Biden, while most Republicans prefer Trump. Independents think Biden would do a better job than Trump, 71 to 27%. 8 in 10 Latinos and 3 in 4 likely voters in other racial and ethnic groups prefer Biden compared to about 6 in 10 whites. Additionally, majorities across regions and demographic groups prefer Biden. And when we look at likely voters who say environmental issues are very important in determining their vote for president, we find that they prefer Biden to Trump by very wide margins, 88 versus 12%. Now, in addition to the findings already shared, I just wanted to highlight some other key findings and takeaways of the survey we did not cover in previous slides. So on the topic of ocean, coastal, and marine life, a majority of Californians say ocean and beach pollution is a problem in the state today. Regionally, residents in Los Angeles are the most likely to say this. Californians also support coastal projects, including 9 to 10 who favor maintaining the existing rules and boundaries of national marine sanctuaries and MPAs off the California coast, and 3 and 4 favor allowing wind power and wave energy projects off the coast. On the issue of water, air, and wildfires, about half of Californians say that the threat of wildfires is a big problem in their part of the state, while fewer say that the supply of water and air pollution is a big problem. Residents in the Bay Area are the most likely to say wildfires and water supply are a big problem, while those in Los Angeles are the most likely to say air pollution is a big problem. When asked about the potential economic effects of California's global warming policies, a plurality of Californians say the state's efforts would lead to more jobs for people around the state, and about 3 in 10 say it would not affect the number of jobs. So while most Californians do not think efforts to address global warming will hurt jobs, half think state action to reduce global warming would increase gasoline prices around the state. On attitudes toward government, we find about half of Californians say they can trust the state government just about always or most of the time when it comes to handling environmental issues in California. Fewer consider the federal government to be trustworthy though. Less than 1 in 4 say they can trust the federal government just about always or most of the time when it comes to handling environmental issues in the US. Now, as the number of coronavirus cases and hospitalizations in California continue to rise, the lives of Californians are changing in ways that can have major effects on the environment. More than 8 in 10 Californians say their lives have been disrupted a lot or some by the coronavirus outbreak, and 74% say that people in their community should always wear a mask when they go to public places. And as Californians struggle to control the spread of COVID-19, a majority say they're not at all likely to take a public bus or transit, as well as fly in an airplane in the next 3 months. Finally, the COVID-19 crisis has shaken public confidence. 80% of Californians say they expect bad times financially in the next 12 months. And Californians are divided on whether the state should take action right away to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rather than wait for the economy and job situation to improve. Nonetheless, solid majorities of Californians say stricter environmental laws and regulations in the state are worth the cost. So at this point, I'd just like to remind the audience to submit any questions they may have to the email listed on the screen. That is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. It'd be great when you send an email to include your affiliation and name as well. In the meantime, I'm going to invite Mark back into the discussion, and then he'll be sharing some key takeaways about the survey.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was a terrific presentation. Nicely summarized many questions that were asked this year. And before I mention a couple of things about takeaways, I just want to mention that this is your 3rd year being project manager, 2018, 2019, 2020 Environment Survey. You've described the survey in other formats as your favorite survey, and I've sometimes said it's my favorite survey too. It's something that we look forward to working on together every year. I'm wondering, this being your 3rd survey, was there anything in particular that surprised you this year about the findings, given that we're living in such a different world than we were in 2018 and 2019?
Yeah, well, we definitely are. And, I'd say I'm happily surprised that Californians continue to approve of the state's leading efforts to tackle climate change, as well as being personally invested in the issue and willing to change. Of course, all going on while the impacts of COVID-19 continue to wreak havoc on our state's way of life and economy. I'd say that overall, that longstanding support is something I was really surprised and happy to see.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we didn't know what to expect in terms of any of the trends that we had seen in the past, given the world has changed so much. One thing that I wanted to mention, because my history with this survey actually goes back to the year 2000, which was quite a while ago, 20 years ago. I want to mention that question one in the survey, well, not question one, but the question about what is the number one environmental issue, the top environmental issue, was the one that surprised me the most, because for the first time in the 20 years that we've been conducting this survey, global warming was named as the number one issue. When we first started asking about this question in 2000, it came up 0 times. And it had been in the single digit for many years, when topics such as air pollution were what people described as the number one issue. Later on, water, most recently during the drought, became the number one issue. But for the first time ever, global warming and climate change. And of course, that led me to wonder about what is it about this year that's for people highlighted the issue of global warming. And maybe it's the combination of California experiencing now not just air pollution, but droughts and wildfires, and maybe a global event like a pandemic that make people think, you know, this is our top issue going forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, I think it was quite interesting that overall regionally climate change was a top issue among several of the state's major regions. And across racial and ethnic groups, we find that about a quarter of Asian Americans and 1 in 5 whites say that climate change is the most important issue. And then when we look at our African American and Latino numbers, we find that actually they name air pollution as the largest problem. So there are some interesting notable racial and ethnic differences as well. But overall, we do see a trend towards more value and importance in just their overall investment in climate change.
Yeah, very interesting. On the question about what's your most important environmental issue, one of the things that surprised me about that answer, and I love that question because it's an open-ended question, and so we don't, other than how we ask the open-ended question, we don't have to think about where those responses come from, because they come from the people. It was interesting to me that 6% said that the coronavirus was the number one environmental issue. What were they thinking?
I mean, from a personal standpoint, I mean, it may relate to just the overall pollution related to coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
I have been seemingly, noticing just walking around, there are more masks that are littered on the ground. We also used more plastic bags during this shelter in place time in California, few million or billion or so. And coronavirus, I think overall, since it affects Californians just at a personal level, widespread. There's been not really an issue that has dominated just overall the global world in the sense that COVID has. And I think at a personal level, people are affected and they're sort of seeing this analogous to climate change, as this is just a major issue that will affect people just moving forward everywhere in the world. Yeah.
And, I was thinking about the way we word that question, that it's the number one environmental issue, not necessarily number one environmental problem, and the ways in which the survey pointed to the fact that it is an environmental issue. When we looked at the findings about, for instance, the number of people who say that it's not at all likely that they're going to fly in an airplane in the next 3 months. That's going to have an impact on the environment if now some people are describing the airline industry as not recovering until 2024. And when we think about what that might mean for emissions, if people aren't flying. That is an environmental issue out of the coronavirus that, could have benefits. But then again, if we take a look at the number of people who say that they don't plan on getting on transit for the next 3 months. And, it's not as if that many people go on transit to begin with, but I went back and I looked at our surveys, and the number of people who say it's very likely that they're going to get on transit is a lot less than the number of people who are typically on transit when they're commuting to their jobs in California. And that's an environmental concern going forward in terms of what we're likely to do, and we were at a point where we were thinking about bringing jobs closer to housing and housing closer to transit. And that depends upon people taking transit. And if they're not going to feel safe about transit, it's going to be an environmental issue that we're going to face going forward. So there's a pro and a con. And then in terms of a lifestyle thing, I was looking at our findings about the numbers of people who say that they're likely to go to a beach in the next 3 months, and the number of people who say that they're not at all likely. And I went back and compared that to the number of people in our past polls who have said that they go to the beach, once a month, once a quarter. Very few people say that they never go to the beach. And so now the number of people who are saying, because it's a public place, and I guess, number one, people are being discouraged from public gatherings, but number two, they're concerned about what kinds of environments they're going to be safe in. The number of people who say that they're not at all likely to go to the beach, that means there are going to be a lot of people depressed this summer because they're not going to be going to the beach like they're used to. So that's an environmental issue and a personal issue too.
Definitely. I mean, there has been sort of a long-standing environmental justice related issue about being able to even get to certain beaches and national parks and having that access. And we do see that definitely play a part in our racial and ethnic breakdowns in our crosstabs for sure.
Yeah. So we have a question from a member of the audience, which I'm glad this question came up because I think this is a good one. On slide 11, where about 47% responded they were not willing to pay more for renewable energy. Was there any discussion or inference of what those costs might be? There was not. Just this was a tracking question, which we just asked generally willingness to cost more. With cap and trade program trading near the auction reserve price, costs in the future incentivize further GHG reductions only have one way to go, and they are likely to be a lot more expensive than they are today. If people are not willing to pay a little bit more today, what would you expect downward shift in the 77%, approving the SB 100 targets as costs escalate in the future? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say for most, I think it is interesting, California's willingness. I mean, they sure are divided when it comes to when they think about their own pockets and, spending their own money about being willing. However, I mean, it is nice to see that Californians in general, the solid majorities are really in favor of these renewable energy goals. And then when looking at cap and trade, I know there's been it's been in the news recently for a number of things. I mean, the first being its latest auction, its revenues were down quite dramatically compared to previous years. And that may concern Californians because less money may be spent on, working in these lower income communities and, not being able to address environmental disparities the way we need to.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that the question about willingness to pay raises a more general question that I don't think we have the answer to now, but I'll just throw it out there. And that is that we saw in this survey so many people who said that they're willing to make lifestyle changes as a result of climate change. And what do you think people mean when they say lifestyle changes? I guess not everybody means a lifestyle change like willingness to pay more in their electricity bill every month. That might be something else other than a lifestyle change. But what would be some examples of lifestyle changes you think maybe we'll ask about next year?
Yeah, well, I mean, some really easy bets or really easy targets are being able to use public transportation and having affordable housing near public transportation and changing the way land use is gone about in California. And then there are more personal behaviors. As California more and more enters towards a drought that's widespread across the state. I know Californians will be concerned about their water use, but also at the same time, I know Californians will also would like to spend less money on water bills. So in that sense, if you use water less, just on simple things like gardening or watering your lawn or whatever that may be, those are easy things that you can help address.
Yeah, thinking about the fact that so much of the California lifestyle revolves around getting in your car and going somewhere, and so much of our air pollution and ultimately greenhouse gas emissions now come from automobile emissions. We'll have to probe a little bit to see whether it's how much of this has to do about driving. But you, again, by pointing out the willingness to live near mass transit brings us right back to that question about where are we going to be after the COVID crisis in terms of our efforts to get people out of their cars and into mass transit, and how long it will be until people feel safe again. So one of the things that I thought was really important about the findings in this survey was, we've been doing this for 20 years. We asked people to look ahead 20 years and asked them how much optimism they had about solving environmental problems in the next 20 years or 20 years from now. And most people said that they had only some optimism. Why is it that you think that more people wouldn't say that they have a great deal of optimism, and what is it that gives people pause for thought to say they have only some optimism?
Yeah, well, I think it's a matter of also our state and federal elected officials and who's in charge at the time. I mean, when we look at our approval ratings, again, at our state elected officials, approval is far higher and more widespread among Californians than it is for our federal elected officials. And then also there's a matter of sort of having trust in your federal elected officials. Californians are much more likely to say that they trust the state government when it comes to handling environmental issues. Compared to the federal government as well. So there's definitely a matter of partisanship and leadership at play in those areas. Yeah.
And I guess that as much as people trust the state government and as much as people say they want the state government to do more, act as a leader, at the end of the day, it's that federal and state partnership which they feel would be needed if we're going to solve environmental problems. And today we're not seeing federal and state partnership. We're seeing federal and state differences. What do you make of the, speaking of federal and state differences, what do you make of the findings on offshore oil drilling in this year's survey?
Yes, offshore oil drilling. So that's a really interesting topic because earlier in July, California's congressional delegation sent a letter to the Secretary of Interior with just their vocalizing their concerns about this proposed more offshore oil drilling. And today, similar to what we find is that very strong majorities of Californians continue to be opposed. I believe Republicans are the only group across all of our demographic groups, as well as regions, to say they are in favor of it. But no, there is widespread disapproval of it. And as well, with these plans, it may affect California's national marine sanctuaries and marine protected areas. With these proposed offshore oil plans. However, overwhelming majorities of Californians are in favor of maintaining the existing rules and boundaries of MPAs and marine national sanctuaries. So there is such a strong value on Californians' coastline across Californians that it is not that surprising that Californians are opposed to, potential damage to that.
Yeah. Most of the time that we've asked about it in the history of the survey, we've found that people have been opposed. And maybe given the way people are feeling about the federal government in California, generally, not everybody, but generally, if anything, it reinforces the difference between where the federal government's going. If you don't trust the federal government, then kind of reinforces that desire to take a different path in terms of where we go with offshore oil drilling. By comparison, lots of support we saw in this survey for the wave and energy projects, just about as many people supporting that as opposing offshore oil. So it's not all about energy development off the coast, but it's certainly about petroleum versus wave and wind power, which people support. Interesting. Let's see. Question about, do you think that various state climate change policies, you asked about cap and trade, is less, why do you think cap and trade is less popular than others, such as emissions targets and renewable energy?
Yeah, I'd say overall, we understand that people are less familiar with cap and trade. Years of tracking this question, we see few Californians, less than 1 in 10, say they've heard a lot about the system. And in fact, majorities of Californians say they've heard nothing at all. So that may play a part into it, their lack of familiarity, but nonetheless, once they've heard about it, they are in favor of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the familiarity in public policy always creates some then ambiguity about supporting it. And the thing, and we've talked about this in our own discussions about as policymakers have over time, the difference between having a carbon tax and a cap and trade policy. I guess if you're looking to clean up the environment and you've got a cap and trade policy in which people are still doing things to make the air dirty, then there's always those questions about, can you put a price on that? And is that price worth it? And can't they just figure out some way to not do that, instead of basically, paying for that. So maybe some of it's around the philosophy behind cap and trade also, that you're putting up with, polluted air in ways that maybe, isn't there a better way to do this? Like renewable energy or emissions targets. So there's another question, but before I ask that question, I think it would be good for both of us to weigh in terms of, this is the first year that we conducted the survey online. Every other time since 2000, we've conducted the survey using random digit dialing. And what prompted the change, and what were the pros and cons of moving to this survey to online?
Yeah, so I'd say the switch to online was really interesting for us. The transition allows us to ask quite a few more questions than we have traditionally due to just the cost and timing of traditional RDD phones surveys. However, we do see that with online, in some of our questions, as you could probably notice in our crosstabs, there tend to be lower levels of item non-response or fewer don't know responses, where an explicit don't know or no opinion option is not provided. In our surveys, we do not offer an explicit don't know, but rather a pop-up box presents that option to a respondent if they try to skip that. So you will see that there are on some of our questions that there are far fewer don't knows, and there are more in certain categories than others than not. But overall, online is a very interesting methodology for us that we hope to continue looking at and working with moving forward.
Yeah, and I might mention for our audience that the challenges of conducting surveys during a pandemic are more easily overcome when you're doing an online survey because our traditional random digit dial live telephone surveys are done out of phone banks, and they can still be done, and they are being done, but they're being done more by people who are working remotely or needing to social distance while they're making the phone calls from the call centers. And we used an online survey in April, which was, of course, at the start of the pandemic, and here again in July. We had a random digit dial survey in between. It went very well. One of the things about conducting surveys in these months during the pandemic is that, like everybody who's listening in today, and like Alyssa and I, a lot of people are at home. And so that phone is going to ring, or you're going to get you're going to get a message to do a survey, and maybe you're going to be that much more accessible for to take part in our surveys. And I certainly think that there have been some advantages for us over the course of the last few months, and we're fortunate to continue to do our work, our survey work, during such a time that's so trying for so many other people to get their work done. I want to just remind everyone who's listening that please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com if you have any. Given that we changed the methodology, do you think that what can you say about the time trends?
Yeah, well, I'd start to say that, we're starting to see larger shares of Californians concerned about the impacts of climate change, as well as being supportive of climate change and energy policy, as well as just more general support for environmental justice related questions. And then just even, for instance, on the issue of wildfires, compared to last year, Californians are more likely to say that wildfires are a problem in their part of California. And also they're more likely to say global warming has contributed to recent wildfires. So there's been a combination of just more support for policies and the impacts of climate change from last year and previous years.
And one of a major emphasis I noticed today in the reporting of the survey findings has been the elevated concerns and interests in environmental issues around African American and Latino respondents in California. And in a year in which we're talking a lot about racial injustice and racial disparities in California, what did those findings, how did they speak to you, Alyssa?
I mean, I think they really resonate with what's going on at the national as well as state landscape. We found that health concerns about pollution are highest for Latinos and African Americans. People of color are also more likely to be exposed to environmental contaminants and live in close proximity to areas near, for instance, oil refineries. The data has shown that. And yeah, as I mentioned during the presentation, African Americans and Latinos are more likely than others to say that air and water pollution in their part of California are very serious health threats. And then we also see just overall, as we have in the past, that Latinos tend to be the most concerned about climate change impacts, as well as understanding of that climate change is happening now, as well as proposals to help address the issue.
One of the things that was interesting to me about the coverage of the survey today and the emphasis on the differences is that these are differences that we've seen for years in our survey. So they're not new, but I think that there's increasing recognition that these are important. And these are issues that we need to deal with going forward. Environmental justice, I think, will be more and more of an issue, but I was glad to see the attention. And it's something that in our briefings we've emphasized in the past. And we design our surveys so that we have enough respondents who are African American, Asian American, Latino, and white, so that we can make those comparisons and see those differences. But the differences are important to note because they really point to significant differences in the living conditions that people have, and then the improvements that need to be made in the environment. And we also, as you mentioned earlier in the briefing, found very strong support for using the cap and trade funds to make environmental improvements in low income and disadvantaged communities. Is there anything about the economy and how the current economic downturn is impacting environmental attitudes that you'd like to mention? We just have a few minutes left for anybody who might have a question for us.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate that Californians, they're divided on whether the state government should act right away to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rather than wait for the economy and job situation to improve. But yeah, again, nonetheless, solid majorities are still supporting that stricter environmental laws and regulation are worth the cost. And then when we look across our racial and ethnic groups, just notable differences are that, you know, African Americans and Asian Americans are more likely than whites to hold this view, as well as Latinos being the most likely to say that state action should begin and that stricter environmental regulations are worth the cost.
Mm-hmm. You know, one thing that I went back and looked at the question about whether we should act now or wait. And we hadn't asked it since the Great Recession for about 10 years. And the results were very similar at that time too. And so it's, I think, a reaction. This is where people are getting pragmatic about policy decisions and giving an indication of putting in context what it means when you have 80% of the people saying that we're going to have bad economic times for the next 12 months, which is similar to what the last time that we asked this question and found a similar divide. If anything, probably shows something about the strength of commitment to environment, where you have 80% of the people saying we're going to have bad economic times in the next 12 months, and half saying we've got to stick to the program at this time as well on the environment. Looking ahead to November, which we'll soon be doing with the survey team, you think the environment's going to be an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. When we ask overall Californians, you know, the most important issue facing the state in general, we often see the environment come up as a top issue, and I would expect it to be a top issue heading to November.
Yeah. And certainly what we see, and I recommend everybody take a closer look at the crosstabs and some of the breakouts that we have within the competitive congressional districts in California, where the race is expected to be close between the Democrats and the Republicans. In a number of those districts, we see that indications that environment's going to be an important topic, and who they trust and what they expect from their member of Congress on the environment will seem to be a factor in that part of our election in November. Well, we're almost out of time, and I want to first of all, a big thank you to Alyssa for being project manager and taking us through the findings today. Really appreciate it. Great to have you as a colleague. I want to thank our funders, both the Capsonells and the Packard Foundation, for making it possible to do this survey in 2020. Very important time for this work to be done. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you pre-registered for this event later today, there will be a survey for you, and we hope you'll take just a couple of minutes, it won't take longer, to fill it out and send it back. And I want to mention that our next, you will be hearing soon about our next events coming up. We have one next Friday with the Speaker Pro Tem, Tony Atkins, on August the 7th at 11 o'clock. And then on August the 14th at 11 o'clock, we will be having a program with the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. And then hopefully more to come later in the month that we're working on. But thank you for joining us once again, and please be safe and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.